The story starts in a cemetery, not inside the orphanage. In 2003, two men who had once lived at Smyllum Park went looking through St. Mary's Cemetery in Lanark. Their names were Frank Doherty and Jim Kane. They were not chasing a ghost story. They were trying to force the past into the open after years of allegations about the home where they had been children. What they found was an overgrown section of ground with no individual markers for the children they believed were buried there. No neat row of named stones. No easy way for a person to stand over one grave and say, "This child was here." Then, in 2017, BBC File on 4 and the Sunday Post reported something that landed like a threat from the soil itself. Their investigation said at least 400 children from Smyllum Park were thought to be buried in that section of St. Mary's Cemetery. Other reporting put the number at 402. The same coverage said the Daughters of Charity had once shown campaigners records pointing to 158 compartments, and the campaigners believed the records were incomplete. That headline is the version that spread: the Catholic-run orphanage, hundreds of children, an unmarked grave. But this case cannot be told honestly if we stop there. The Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry later examined the burial records directly. Its official finding was narrower. Between 1900 and 1981, 16 under 18 residents were recorded as buried in the Smyllum plot at St. Mary's Parish Church Cemetery. The inquiry also said there were no individual layers recorded and no headstones for those children. Some children linked to Smyllum were buried somewhere else. So the horror here is not a clean internet headline. It is worse in a different way. It is an institution where children were abused. It is a cemetery story that became larger than the official records could prove. It is an official inquiry that still found nameless child burials, missing records, no punishment books, patchy discharge dates, and a serious failure in care. The ground matters, the records matter more. Smyllum Park School stood in Lanark, Scotland, and it was run by the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. The order opened the home in 1864 and kept it open until 1981. Across that stretch, the order's own figures given to the inquiry said 11,601 children were accommodated at Smyllum, from opening to closure. On paper, the mission looked charitable. The children were orphans, or children from families that could not keep them, or children from homes described in the reporting as broken. The institution was supposed to be care. It was supposed to be safety. It was supposed to be the place adults sent a child when there was nowhere better to send them. The Daughters of Charity were a Catholic religious order, but the inquiry recorded an important structural detail. The order was autonomous and not subject to the Scottish Roman Catholic hierarchy. A safeguarding representative told the inquiry the order answered through its own chain of authority, not local bishops. That matters because this video is not about blaming every Catholic person or every parish. It is about a specific religious order, a specific home, and the children who lived under its control. Smyllum was one of 6 residential establishments the order ran for children in Scotland. The inquiry's case study focused especially on Smyllum Park in Lanark and Bellevue Children's Home in Rutherglen. Together, they became the first case study in the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry's work on residential care. By the time the inquiry looked back, Smyllum had already closed for decades. The property had moved into another life. Former residents had grown older. Some had died before the public record caught up with what they said happened to them. That delay is part of the story. Abuse inside an institution does not end when the building shuts. It follows people into adulthood, and then if records are missing, it follows them into a second fight just to prove what the building did. The Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry did not describe Smyllum as a stern home that merely belonged to a harsher age. Its findings were much stronger than that. It concluded that children were abused while in the care of the Daughters of Charity in Scotland. For many children in Smyllum and Bellevue, the homes were places of fear, coercive control, threat, excessive discipline, and emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. The inquiry recorded that children found no love, no compassion, no dignity, and no comfort. That is not a line from a horror writer. That is the official finding of the inquiry. The physical abuse was not described as one type of punishment. It was a system of punishment. Children were hit with hands and with objects. The inquiry named leather straps, the lochgelly taws, hairbrushes, sticks, footwear, rosary beads, wooden crucifixes, and a dog's lead. For some children, being hit was not an unusual event. It was part of ordinary life. Runaways were beaten when they were returned. The inquiry noted there was no recognition that a child running away was likely unhappy or distressed. There was no comfort, no understanding, no reassurance. The child came back, and punishment followed. Then there were the bedwetting practices. Children who wet the bed were beaten, put in cold baths, and humiliated. Some were made to wear wet sheets, some were subjected to name-calling by sisters and by other children who were encouraged to take part. The shame was not accidental. The shame was part of the control. The inquiry also found force feeding. Children were grabbed by the backs of their heads, their noses were held so they had to open their mouths. Food was forced in even when they vomited it back. Chores were heavy and unduly burdensome. Children were used as unpaid labor in circumstances where the home did not have enough staff and did not have enough money to employ enough staff. Bathing practices were also found to be abusive. Children queued undressed. Privacy was lacking. Shared bathwater could be too hot, too cold, or dirty. Siblings were routinely separated. Some family visitors were sent away. Some children were told they did not have family anymore. The inquiry found no reliable system for marking children's birthdays, and some children did not know when their birthday was. Even identity could become a target. The inquiry found that left-handed children were abused by being forced to use their right hand. Protestant children were called names and treated as lesser. One child was told his Jewishness would be knocked out of him while he was being beaten. High-achieving children were not praised, they were denigrated. Smyllum is not a vague story about a cruel old orphanage. The record is specific. Objects were named, practices were named, children were separated from siblings, humiliated for bodily accidents, and punished for parts of themselves they did not choose. The inquiry also recorded specific deaths of children who lived at Smyllum. These details have to be handled carefully. There is no need to invent anything around them. The official facts are heavy enough. Samuel Carr died when he was 6 years old. The inquiry found that he died after contracting a severe and vicious E. coli infection after contact with a rat. It also recorded that he was malnourished despite having been in Smyllum for a significant time, and that he had received a severe beating from a sister not long before his death. Francis McColl died at 13. He was hit by a golf club during an activity. The inquiry recorded that Francis had a significant hearing deficit, which was known to the sisters. If a warning to stand back was given, the inquiry found it was likely Francis did not hear it. The activity was poorly supervised. A child with a known hearing problem was in the middle of a dangerous situation and the system around him failed. Patricia Meenan died at 12. She ran away from Smyllum and was hit by a car while trying to go back toward Glasgow. One account in the inquiry said Patricia was always running away. Another recalled that she had received a letter from her mother saying she would visit, that the visit did not happen, and that Patricia was upset and tried to walk to Glasgow. The official record is enough. A 12-year-old child left the home, reached the road, and died from her injuries 3 days later. David Carberry was almost 4. His death certificate recorded bronchopneumonia. His older brother Leon told the inquiry that after the children were admitted to Smyllum, David was placed in another part of the home and Leon never saw him again. Leon recalled being told by a sister that David had died. He later learned the cause of death was not what he remembered being told. He said he did not know where David was buried. These 4 names do not prove every allegation ever made about Smyllum. They do something more disciplined and harder to dismiss. They show how the official findings dealt with individual children, records, causes of death, supervision, running away, illness, and the absence of answers families carried for decades. This is where the burial story has to be told with both pieces in view. In 2003, Frank Doherty and Jim Kane found the overgrown, unmarked section of St. Mary's Cemetery. They had lived at Smyllum. They were part of the survivor effort to expose physical abuse at the home. In 2004, according to BBC reporting, the campaigners said the Daughters of Charity told them records suggested children had been buried in 158 compartments in the graveyard. The 2 men believed the number was higher because the records were incomplete. They did not live to see the full public argument around the story. But in 2017, BBC File on 4 and the Sunday Post reported that death certificate searches pointed to 402 children from Smyllum Park, with only 2 found to have been buried elsewhere. The Guardian covered the claim as an allegation being investigated by the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. That version is powerful because it feels simple. Hundreds of children, 1 institution, 1 cemetery, 1 unmarked plot. But the later official inquiry did what official inquiries are supposed to do. It narrowed the claim to what the available burial records could establish. The inquiry found that between 1900 and 1981, 16 under 18-year-olds recorded as residents at Smyllum were buried in the Smyllum plot within St. Mary's Parish Church Cemetery in Lanark. It found no record of the individual layers and no headstones marking them. It also noted that various sisters and Charlie Forsyth were buried in the same cemetery, but their graves were marked and had headstones with inscriptions. That contrast is brutal without exaggeration. Adults connected to the institution had marked graves. The children in the Smyllum plot did not have individual markers. The inquiry also warned that a child recorded in death registers with a link to Smyllum was not necessarily buried at St. Mary's. Patricia Meenan, for example, was buried in Glasgow. It noted that unmarked burials were not uncommon during the period because cost was often an issue. A memorial stone now stands at the cemetery erected by the order after a campaign by in-care abuse survivors. The inquiry recorded that the stone does not bear the names of individual children, so the fair version is this. The 400-plus burial claim belongs to 2017 investigative reporting and survivor campaigning. The official finding based on burial records was 16 recorded under 18 residents in the Smyllum plot from 1900 to 1981, without individual layers or headstones. The larger number should not be sold as proven fact. But the official number is still not clean. 16 children, no individual markers, incomplete records, and an institution already found to have abused children. That is still a cemetery story. The records are the second graveyard in this case. In 1959, regulations for children's homes in Scotland set out record-keeping duties. Homes were supposed to maintain personal histories, medical histories, admission circumstances, progress records, family visits, emotional difficulties, and destinations after discharge. Deaths were supposed to be reported to the Secretary of State. When the inquiry looked at Smyllum, the order could not show that death reports had been made. The order presumed it had complied, but its safeguarding representative said there was nothing in the records to prove that had happened. National archives were examined on behalf of the inquiry, and no record was found to show the reports had been made. Admissions registers existed, at least in part, but discharge records were patchy. The circumstances of admission and destinations after discharge were not kept beyond basic registers. Punishment books were not kept. Sister Eileen Glancy confirmed that it did not appear Smyllum had a practice of recording punishments, and said she had gleaned from the sisters themselves that they did not record them. This matters because abuse without records becomes harder to investigate. A punishment not written down can disappear into a child's memory. A discharge date missing from the file can break the line between where a child was and who was responsible. A death report that cannot be found becomes another place where the institution asks everyone else to trust what it cannot prove. The inquiry's conclusion was blunt. The Daughters of Charity accepted that, on the face of it, the order did not comply with the record-keeping provisions of the 1959 regulations. The inquiry called the failure to keep adequate records of the children a serious failure in care. The numbers in the appendix add another layer. The order reported 121 complaints of alleged abuse at Smyllum made to it between 1998 and 2002. It also reported 99 civil actions raised against the order in relation to Smyllum. Those numbers do not describe every life inside the home. They show how long the past kept coming back through formal complaints and legal action. The story did not end with the inquiry. In December 2023, Police Scotland announced convictions after a 6-week trial at Airdrie Sheriff Court. Sister Sarah McDermott, Sister Eileen Igo, and carer Margaret Hughes were found guilty of cruel and unnatural treatment of children under their care at Smyllum Park. The incidents happened between 1969 and 1981, while children were in the care of the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. The victims included boys and girls. BBC court reporting described children being subjected to cruel and unnatural incidents. Police Scotland called the case complex and commended the courage of survivors who had to revisit traumatic periods of their lives during the trial. Detective Inspector Jim McLaughlin said orphan children had been placed in the care of people running Smyllum House, which was supposed to be a place of safety. That phrase is the whole case in miniature, supposed to be a place of safety. Not a prison, not a punishment yard, not a room where childhood became something to survive, a place of safety. The convictions address specific criminal charges against specific women. They do not stand in for every allegation about Smyllum, and they do not need to. By the time they arrived, the public record already contained the inquiry findings, the survivor campaigns, the burial argument, and the record-keeping failures. The trial added something else, a court verdict, decades after the doors closed. Smyllum Park is not a story that needs invented shadows. The real ones are already in the paperwork. The Catholic religious order ran a home for children in Lanark from 1864 to 1981. More than 11,000 children passed through it. The Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry found that many children experienced fear, coercive control, excessive discipline, humiliation, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. It found that children were beaten with named implements, punished for bedwetting, force-fed, separated from siblings, deprived of reliable family contact, and left without adequate records. The cemetery story remains complicated. The 2017 reports of at least 400 or 402 children belong to investigative journalism and survivor campaigning. The official inquiry finding was 16 under 18 residents recorded in the Smyllum plot between 1900 and 1981, no individual layers and no headstones for those children. That correction matters. It keeps the story honest. But the correction does not make Smyllum less horrific. It means the horror has to be carried by what can be proven official abuse findings. Named child deaths in the inquiry, missing record trails, a memorial stone without individual names, a serious failure in care, and criminal convictions decades later. The worst version of this story is not that every dark headline was simple and true. The worst version is that children entered a place built to protect them, and when survivors came back years later, they had to fight through silence, missing records, legal proceedings, and cemetery ground just to get a public record of what happened there. That is Smyllum Park. Not a legend, not a made-up campfire monster, a home that kept records badly, punished children brutally, and left too many names for other people to recover.